Boots. Get off my aircraft now. Before I call security and make this a lot worse for you. Alicia Bennett stood at the top of the boarding stairs, with one hand on the cold aluminum rail, and the other wrapped around the strap of a scuffed brown leather bag that had seen 15 years and 3 continents. Boots. The wind off the tarmac at Charlotte Douglas pushed against her gray hoodie. Her sneakers were still damp from the dew she'd walked through at 5:40 that morning. Boots. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. She looked, to the woman blocking the cabin door, like a problem that hadn't been cleared for boarding. Boots. That was all Karen Whitfield needed to see. Karen stood framed in the doorway of the Gulfstream in a navy uniform so crisp it looked laminated, her blonde hair pulled back so tight, not a single strand dared move in the wind. Boots. Her smile had all the right muscles, doing all the right things, and none of the warmth. "Can I help you?" "Boots," she asked. "Not good morning, not welcome aboard. Just that, flat as a closed door." "I'm Alicia Bennett," she said. Boots. "I'm on this flight." Karen's eyes went from the hoodie to the jeans to the bag hanging low on her hip, and the pause that followed was short, but not short enough to hide what it was doing. Boots. Cataloging. Doting. Deciding. "This is a private charter," Karen said. "The client hasn't arrived yet. I am the client." Behind Karen, a younger flight attendant froze mid-step near the galley curtain. Boots. Rachel Doyle, 27 quiet eyes, hands that never quite stopped moving. She heard it. She watched Karen's jaw tightened into something practiced. Boots. Karen let out a short laugh, the kind with no joy inside it. "I'm going to need to see identification, ma'am." Boots. Alicia reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone with the unhurried patience of someone who had been awake since 4A. Boots. M reviewing a term sheet and no longer had the energy to be surprised by people. She opened the confirmation email and turned the screen toward Karen. Boots. Name, tail number, departure time, Nashville. Everything a person would need to see if seeing was actually the goal. Karen leaned in, looked at the screen for exactly 1 second longer than it took to read it, and said, "This could be anyone's phone." Boots. Rachel's lips parted. She looked down at the napkin she was folding for the 3rd time, then back up, caught somewhere between what she'd been trained to do and what she knew was right. Boots. "It's my phone," Alicia said, "with my name on my flight." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The engines were still cold and silent. Boots. Somewhere across the ramp, a fuel truck beeped as it backed away from another aircraft, an ordinary sound that felt obscene next to the insult, still hanging in the air between 2 women who were, technically, standing 4 feet apart and worlds away from each other. Boots. Karen stepped aside. Barely. Alicia had to turn her shoulder to fit through the gap, and as she passed, Karen leaned back half an inch, as if contact might leave a mark on her uniform. Boots. Alicia noticed. She always noticed. 22 years of noticing had trained her eyes to catch the things people thought didn't register. The tightened grip on a purse, the extra glance at security, the surprised beat before someone called her ma'am instead of something smaller. Boots. The way respect showed up only after a title did, and never a second before. Remember this moment because it comes back later, and it comes back louder. Boots. Inside, the cabin was the kind of beautiful that costs real money to make look effortless. Cream leather seats stitched in pale gold thread. Boots. Warm walnut paneling polished until it threw back the morning light. A cashmere throw folded on the forward seat. A narrow glass vase with 3 white peonies that had clearly been changed out that morning. Boots. Her seat. Her plane, technically in every sense that mattered, and one sense that Karen hadn't figured out yet. Alicia lowered herself into the forward chair, set her bag down beside her, and for one long moment closed her eyes. Boots. On her left wrist, half hidden under the hoodie's cuff, sat a scratched stainless steel wristwatch, the crystal fogged with age, the band replaced twice. Boots. It had belonged to her mother, Ruth Bennett, who had worked the overnight shift at Mercy General in Winston-Salem for 31 years, and still ironed her scrubs before every single one of them. Boots. On the back, worn almost smooth by decades of a nurse's hands, 4 words were engraved. "Treat people right first." Boots. Alicia touched it once, out of habit, and let herself believe, for about 90 seconds, that the worst of the morning was already behind her. Boots. Then Karen's heels clicked toward her down the aisle. "Excuse me." Karen stood over the seat with her arms folded. Boots. "That seat is reserved for the primary client." Alicia opened her eyes. "I know," she said, quiet as a closed drawer. Boots. "That's why I'm sitting in it." Karen's smile dropped off her face like something had cut the string holding it up. Boots. In the galley, Rachel forgot to breathe for a full second. For most of her life, Alicia had understood something that took other people decades to learn, if they ever learned it at all. Some people don't need proof. Boots. They need permission to see you as a person, and if they've already decided not to give it, no document on earth will change their mind for them. Boots. Karen shifted her weight. I was told the primary client might send someone in her place. A representative. Staff. Who told you that? Boots. A blink. The manifest lists a Ms. Bennett. That's me. I understand what you're saying. No, Alicia said, and there was nothing sharp in her voice which somehow made it land harder. Boots. You understand what you want to understand. Outside, the ground crew gave the final wave. The cabin door sealed with a heavy final sound, and the soft hiss of pressurization filled the space where the argument had been. Boots. A moment later, Captain Daniel Cross's voice came over the speaker, warm and practiced. Morning, folks. We're cleared for Nashville. Boots. Smooth skies the whole way. Should have you on the ground in about an hour 40. Alicia turned her face toward the window and watched the hangars slide past, the fuel trucks, the men in reflective vests catching the early gold light, and let herself hope, for the second time that morning, that this was as bad as it was going to get. Boots. It was not. Karen walked past her without a glance and disappeared into the cockpit with a tray, porcelain cup, warm croissant wrapped in linen, a small dish of berries, a hot towel rolled with more care than anything Alicia had been offered since arriving. Boots. Through the open cockpit door, Karen's voice turned instantly, effortlessly soft. Here you go, Captain. Fresh, just how you like it. Boots. You spoil us, Cross said and laughed. That's what I'm here for. The door shut. Karen came back through the cabin and did not look at Alicia. Boots. Not once. The smell of butter and coffee trailed behind her, like something deliberately left in the air. Alicia looked down at her own hands. Boots. Steady, always steady. This wasn't shock. She was long past being shocked by this particular flavor of small cruelty. Boots. It was recognition. The tired kind, the kind that says quietly, here we are again. She pressed the call button. Boots. A soft chime, an amber light above her seat. Karen stood 4 feet away in the galley, looked directly at the light, and began rearranging silverware that was already perfectly straight. Boots. 1 minute passed. Then 2, the jet climbed, the cabin tilting gently, engines deepening under the floor. Alicia didn't press it a second time. Boots. She didn't say a word. She simply watched, and so did Rachel, whose hands had gone still on the napkin she'd already folded 4 times. Boots. At minute 4, Rachel swallowed hard. At minute 5, she stepped forward. Ma'am, she said softly, I'm so sorry about the wait. Boots. Can I get you something? Black coffee, please, Alicia said, and her eyes weren't unkind, just tired in a way that made the room feel smaller. Boots. Of course, Karen shut the galley drawer with a crack loud enough to make Rachel flinch. What are you doing? Boots. She asked for coffee. I heard the call button. I'll handle the cabin, Karen said, low, clipped final. You handle the cockpit service. Boots. Rachel's mouth opened and closed. She glanced at Alicia, 1 second, maybe 2, an apology with no sound attached to it, and stepped back toward the galley wall. Boots. Here's the part worth paying attention to. Boots. Somewhere in the next 40 minutes, a small object was going to move from Karen's hand to Alicia's face, and everything that came after it, the headlines, the lawyers, the boardroom, the resignation, would trace back to this exact moment right here, where a 27-year-old woman decided her job security mattered more than a cup of coffee. Boots. Keep that in mind. It matters more than it sounds like it should. 20 minutes into the flight, Karen returned to the forward cabin holding a printed manifest, the kind of document people wave when they've run out of real authority and need to borrow some from a piece of paper. Boots. I need to confirm something, she said. This charter is booked under Solstice Dynamics. Are you an employee? I'm the CEO. Boots. Karen actually laughed. Not loud, not friendly. The kind of laugh people use when they've decided a thing is as possible and don't feel like pretending otherwise. Boots. Ma'am, I've flown executives for 11 years. I think I'd know. You'd think, Alicia said and turned back to the window. Boots. Karen's face went the color of the manifest in her hand. I'm going to need you to lower your voice. Boots. I haven't raised it. You're making this difficult. I asked for coffee 40 minutes ago. Rachel from the galley spoke without meaning to. Boots. It's been 22 minutes, actually. The words came out before she could stop them, and the second they landed, she looked like she wanted to fold herself into the napkin she was still holding. Boots. Karen turned on her. Excuse me, I was tracking it. For the log. Rachel's voice had gone thin as paper. Boots. Go check the lavatory supplies, Karen said. And it wasn't a request, Rachel went. Of course she went. Boots. She had rent due on the 4th, a supervisor who wrote her evaluations, and 11 months left before her contract came up for renewal, and every one of those facts sat on her chest like a stone while she walked away and left Alicia sitting alone with a woman who had now decided, out loud, in front of a witness, that the coffee simply wasn't going to happen. Boots. It didn't happen. Not at minute 30, not at minute 40. When Alicia finally stood to get water for herself, Karen stepped directly into the aisle, blocking it with her body the way you'd block a door. Boots. Passengers need to remain seated during meal service. There's no meal service happening. There hasn't been any service at all. Boots. I'm going to ask you one more time to sit down. I'm going to ask you one more time for water. Boots. And this is the part that changes the whole flight. Karen's hand came up. Not to hand her a glass, not to gesture toward a seat, but flat and fast and aimed at Alicia's face, and it connected with a sound sharp enough to silence the entire cabin. Boots. The sound of an open palm against a cheekbone at 31,000 feet doesn't echo. It doesn't need to. It just sits there in the recycled air, and everyone who hears it knows exactly what it means, whether they want to admit it or not. Boots. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. The engines kept running underneath the silence, like the world hadn't noticed what had just happened up here. Boots. Alicia didn't touch her face. She didn't raise her voice. She stood very still, the red print of a hand rising slowly on her left cheek, and looked at Karen with an expression that had nothing shaking in it at all. Boots. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, Alicia said. Quiet. Level. Not a threat. A fact. Delivered the way you'd read a flight time off a schedule. Boots. Karen's chest was heaving. You grabbed my wrist. You were coming at me. I asked for water. You need to sit down before I have the captain radio ahead. Boots. Do it, Alicia said. Please, radio ahead. Karen didn't move. From the galley, Rachel had come back with a stack of lavatory towels still in her hands, and she stood frozen in the aisle with her mouth open, watching a red mark deepen on the face of the woman she'd tried, badly, to help 20 minutes earlier. Boots. She had heard it. She had seen it. And in the 2 seconds after it happened, before she could stop herself, she pulled out her phone and pressed record because some part of her, the part that hadn't yet learned to be afraid all the way through, understood that this was the moment where silence stopped being an option. Boots. Captain Cross's voice crackled through the intercom. Everything all right back there? Karen's answer came fast and smooth, the practiced voice she'd used for the coffee, for the croissant, for every soft landing she'd ever made with someone who outranked her. Boots. All good, Captain. Minor turbulence. Alicia looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her own phone, and made a call. Boots. Denise, she said, once the line connected, calm as a woman reading a grocery list. I need you to pull the tail number for the Vantage Air charter I'm on right now, and I need you to have security and the FBO waiting when we land in Nashville. Boots. I've just been assaulted by the lead flight attendant. The word assaulted did something to the cabin. Karen's face went white, then blotchy, then defensive all over again, because that was the only gear she had left. Boots. That is not what happened. It's exactly what happened, Alicia said. And there's a witness standing 4 feet from you holding a phone. Boots. Rachel's hand tightened around the phone. She didn't lower it. Here is what Karen didn't know. Sitting there at 31,000 feet with a red handprint drying on someone else's face, and a bad excuse already forming on her tongue. Boots. Solstice Dynamics wasn't just the client on this charter. Solstice Dynamics was, as of 6 months earlier, the majority stakeholder in a $200 million service agreement that Vantage Air had spent 18 months courting, the kind of contract that pays for hangars, for fleet upgrades, for the very jet she was standing in. Boots. And the woman she'd just called a liar and slapped across the face was the person whose signature was on it. Boots. She'd find that out in about 40 minutes. It would not go well for her. The remaining descent into Nashville happened in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of noise. Boots. Karen retreated to the galley and stayed there, arms folded, jaw set, rehearsing a version of events in her head that would somehow come out sounding reasonable. Boots. Rachel sat 2 rows back, phone still recording, hands trembling around it, thinking about every complaint she'd ever swallowed for the sake of a paycheck, and wondering if this was finally the one she couldn't swallow. Boots. And Alicia sat by the window with her mother's watch turned face up on her wrist, saying nothing at all, because she had learned a long time ago that the people who need you to explain yourself have usually already decided not to listen. Boots. When the wheels touched down in Nashville, there were 2 black SUVs waiting on the ramp, along with a man in a gray suit holding a tablet and an airport operations badge clipped to his belt. Boots. His name was Marcus Felt, Chief Financial Officer of Vantage Air, and he had received a call 22 minutes earlier that had made him leave a board meeting without explanation. Boots. The cabin door opened. Karen stepped forward first, professional smile reassembled, ready to greet the ground team the way she'd greeted every ground team for 11 years. Boots. Ms. Whitfield, Felt said before she could speak. You're going to want to sit back down. Karen's smile faltered. I'm sorry, who are you? Boots. I'm the person who just watched a video, Felt said, and held up his phone. That was the second frozen moment of the day. Boots. Karen stood in the cabin doorway, with the Nashville sun coming in sideways behind her, and for the first time since the tarmac in Charlotte, her face didn't know what expression to wear. Boots. Alicia walked past her without a word, the handprint still visible on her cheek, her mother's catching the light as she descended the stairs, and behind her, Rachel Doyle stood in the aisle, holding a phone with 51 minutes of audio and 11 minutes of video, trying to decide whether the shaking in her hands was fear or relief. Boots. It turned out, over the following weeks, that it was mostly the second one. By the time Alicia's black SUV pulled away from the ramp, 3 separate calls had already gone out. Boots. One to Vantage Air's General Counsel, Vanessa Cole. One to the Nashville field office of the Transportation Security Administration. Boots. And one, quietly, from Rachel Doyle's own phone, to a number she'd been given months earlier by a woman in human resources who'd once told her, if you ever see something you can't explain away, call me directly, not your supervisor. Boots. Nobody on that jet believed, in the moment the door closed and the wheels went up in Charlotte, that any of this would matter beyond the 4 walls of the cabin. Boots. That was the mistake. It's always the mistake. Boots. The Vantage Air headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower off Piedmont Row in Charlotte, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon the 32nd floor conference room was full in a way it had never been full before. Not for an earnings call, not for a board vote. Not even the year the company nearly lost its FAA operating certificate over a maintenance dispute. Boots. 12 executives sat around a long walnut table, with their phones face down and their expressions doing the math. Nobody wanted to say out loud. Boots. Preston Hale, chief executive of Vantage Air, stood at the head of the table, looking a decade older than he had at breakfast. Boots. The Solstice Dynamics contract is terminated, he said, effective immediately. Marcus Felt closed his eyes. That contract was $200 million. Boots. It was the backbone of next year's fleet expansion. I know. Vanessa Cole, general counsel, leaned forward, glasses pushed up into her hair. Boots. What evidence does Bennett have? Audio, 51 minutes. Video for the last 11. Vanessa's expression shifted in the specific way that only lawyers' faces shift. Not shock, calculation, the sound of damage being measured in real time. Boots. Does it include the assault? Yes. Does it include the racial commentary? Hale hesitated half a second too long. Yes. Boots. The room went quiet enough to hear the air handler humming above the table. At the far end, Renee Foster, head of compliance, laid both hands flat on a manila folder she'd carried in under her arm and hadn't opened yet. Boots. We had complaints, she said. Felt looked at her. What complaints? Renee didn't answer him. She looked at Hale instead, and Hale's stomach dropped somewhere around the 30th floor. Boots. Human Resources pulled Karen Whitfield's personnel file within the hour. It was thicker than anyone expected. 3 formal complaints in 5 years, every one of them from a passenger of color. Boots. One alleged she'd refused boarding assistance to an elderly man on a charter to Miami until his adult son intervened. Boots. A second described her questioning a business owner's credentials in front of the partners he'd flown in to impress. Boots. The third was a handwritten letter from a retired school principal in Maryland, describing, in careful, restrained language, how Karen had made her stand outside the aircraft in the rain confirming eligibility while her own grandchildren watched from the terminal window. Boots. All three had been marked resolved, no retraining, no follow-up call to a single passenger, just a signature, a date, and a closed file. Boots. Renee's voice was steady but low as she read the summaries aloud. By the second complaint, one junior HR associate had left the room in tears. Boots. By the third, nobody at the table could look at anyone else. Vanessa took off her glasses and set them down with a small, deliberate click. Boots. This is negligent supervision, she said. If this becomes public, and it will become public, we are not defending one bad employee. Boots. We are defending a company that read 3 warnings and chose to file them instead of act on them. Hale sat down slowly. Boots. For years he had believed the culture of his company was whatever appeared on the recruiting website, the diversity statement released every February and quietly forgotten by March, the smiling crew photos, the mission language about respect and excellence. Boots. He understood, sitting at that table at 4:40 in the afternoon. That culture isn't what a company prints. It's what a company tolerates when nobody with power is watching. Boots. His phone buzzed. A message from airport operations. Whitfield escorted off Vantage property. Doyle and Captain Cross awaiting internal interview. Boots. Then a second message, from an entirely different direction. Skyline Business Wire requesting comment on alleged in-flight assault involving Solstice Dynamics CEO Alicia Bennett. Boots. His mouth went dry. Vanessa saw his face change and asked what it was. It's already leaking, he said, and set the phone on the table, and the room leaned in around it like something being buried. Boots. By the next morning, Vantage Air could not call it an internal matter anymore. Skyline Business Wire ran the story before sunrise, under the headline Vantage Air loses $200 million contract after attendant slaps client's CEO mid-flight. Boots. By noon, it was on every business desk in the country. By evening, Alicia Bennett's face was on television screens next to a photograph of a Gulfstream on a tarmac, and the recording, the real recording, Rachel's 51 minutes with the last 11 on video, did what 100 corporate statements never could. Boots. It made people listen. Karen's voice, clear and cold at the top of the stairs, the fake identification check, the comment about who belonged on that aircraft and who didn't, delivered in a tone so casual it was almost worse than shouting. Boots. Then the slap, sharp, undeniable, followed by 3 seconds of nothing but engine noise. That silence, worse than the sound before it, was the part people replayed the most. Boots. Vantage Air suspended Karen within hours and terminated her before the week was out. Boots. Mecklenburg County prosecutors, reviewing the recording alongside 3 prior complaints that were now impossible to call unrelated, upgraded the initial misdemeanor filing to felony assault, citing what the district attorney's office called a documented pattern the employer had actual knowledge of and failed to correct. Boots. Karen's attorney pushed for a plea. She refused for 3 months, insisting in every meeting that she had been provoked, that Alicia had grabbed her wrist first, that the video was missing context. Boots. It wasn't missing anything. Eventually, facing a jury that had already seen the footage on the news 40 times, she pleaded guilty. Boots. She received 18 months, most of them suspended, 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a permanent disqualification from any FAA-regulated aviation role. A line item that meant, for a woman who had spent 11 years building a career 11,000 feet above the ground, she would never work in it again. Boots. Captain Daniel Cross retired before the internal review even finished. Boots. His name never made the headlines the way Karen's did, but the final report said enough on its own. He had heard the call button ignored twice, had been told everything was fine over the intercom without confirming it himself, and had chosen, in the moment it mattered most, comfort over duty. Boots. He had a warm croissant in front of him, and a woman with a red handprint on her face 40 feet behind him, and he picked the croissant. Boots. That was the whole story, in the end. It didn't need much more than that. Rachel Doyle testified in the civil proceedings that followed, hands trembling, voice steady. Boots. I was afraid, she told the room, but I've learned that fear doesn't make silence harmless. Alicia, seated across the courtroom, lowered her eyes when she heard it, not in judgment but in recognition, because she had spent a long time learning the exact same lesson from the exact opposite direction. Boots. Vantage Air settled with Solstice Dynamics, under terms that were never fully disclosed, though the number that leaked to the business press was large enough to make the company's investors visibly wince on the next earnings call. Boots. More significant than the money, the settlement required independent oversight of Vantage Air's entire charter division for 3 years. New complaint review protocols protected bias reporting for crew members, mandatory discipline audits, and training that involved actual scenario work instead of a video employees clicked through while checking their phones under the table. Boots. Preston Hale resigned before the fiscal year ended. His replacement was Camille Ortiz, formerly the company's own director of flight operations, the first black woman to lead Vantage Air in its 40-year history. Boots. At her first press conference, she didn't hide behind lawyer-approved language. "What happened to Ms. Bennett was preventable," she said. Boots. "It was also predictable because we had 3 warnings and we filed every one of them instead of acting on them." Boots. "A company isn't judged by the values it prints on a wall. It's judged by the behavior it allows to keep happening." Boots. Alicia wasn't in the room for that press conference. Boots. She was 200 miles away in Concord, North Carolina, signing that same $200 million service agreement with a much smaller aerospace maintenance firm called Meridian Aerostructures. 12 employees, solid safety scores, and a modest metal-sided building near the regional airport that most people in the industry had never heard of. Boots. "They were ready," she told a reporter who asked why she'd chosen a company that small for a contract that large. Boots. "They just needed someone to stop confusing unfamiliar with unqualified." Within 18 months, Meridian had grown to more than 200 employees. Boots. Some were young mechanics straight out of technical college. Some were older workers who'd assumed their best opportunities had already passed them by, quietly filed under, overlooked the same way. 3 complaints had once been quietly filed under resolved. Boots. Alicia didn't call it charity, and she was quick to correct anyone who did. She called it good business, and she was right. Boots. 7 months after the flight, Alicia stood on a stage at a national aviation industry conference in Orlando, in front of 800 people, executives, pilots, crew trainers, regulators, people who built the systems, and people who'd been chewed up by them. Boots. She wore a black suit that day. No hoodie, no attempt to disappear into a room. But when she started speaking, her voice was the same low-level voice from the cabin. Boots. "I didn't cancel that contract because I was offended," she said. "I canceled it because when a company mistreats someone it thinks has no power, that tells you exactly what the company does with power it actually has." Boots. The mistake wasn't one flight attendant. The mistake was a system that read 3 complaints and decided the easiest thing to do was nothing at all. Boots. Nobody in the room moved for a second. Then the applause started. Not loud at first, then steadier, then a few hundred people rising out of their seats, not because the story was comfortable to hear, but because it was true, and true things have a way of pulling people to their feet, even when they'd rather stay seated. Boots. Alicia looked out over the room and thought, for just a moment, of her mother, finishing a double shift at Mercy General at 7 in the morning and still pressing the wrinkles out of her scrubs before she left for the next one. Boots. Ruth Bennett used to say it to her daughter every single day before school. "Baby, treat people right before you know who they are." Boots. By the time you find out, it shouldn't matter. That was the whole lesson, really. Power doesn't always arrive in a black car with a driver holding the door. Boots. It doesn't always wear a tailored suit or a name tag with a title underneath it. Sometimes power steps onto a private jet in a gray hoodie, exhausted from a long week, asking for nothing more than a cup of coffee and a little peace. Boots. And dignity was never supposed to depend on whether somebody happened to recognize your name before deciding you deserved it. Boots. After the applause faded, Alicia stepped down from the stage, and a young woman from the audience, a first-year flight attendant trainee, as it turned out, 23 years old and visibly nervous, approached her near the side exit and asked quietly what she was supposed to do if she ever saw something like that happening, and was too scared to say anything in the moment. Boots. Alicia looked at her for a long second, touched the scratched watch on her wrist without quite realizing she was doing it, and said, "Say something small." Boots. It doesn't have to be brave, it just has to be true. The small thing is usually enough to start. Boots. She didn't wait for a reaction. She simply nodded once, the way her mother used to nod at the end of a long shift, and walked out into the Orlando evening, where a car was already waiting to take her to the next thing, and the thing after that, in a life that had never once needed anyone's permission to matter. Boots. If this story reminded you of a moment you witnessed, or a moment you survived, share it. Someone else out there might need to know they weren't imagining it. Boots. And if you believe respect should come before status, stay close. There are more stories like this one, where the truth takes its time, but it always finds the runway in the end.